I'm also a hobbyist like all of you. Got my first collector car in 1967, a Model A Ford, two-door. Later got a 40 Ford convertible, and then finally ran out of time and didn't do anything with cars then until the late 60s, 68 or 69. Got a 37 Packard 12 formal sedan. 6 years ago, we drove that from Times Square to San Francisco. I've had a number of cars since then, including a couple of Cadillacs. Been in the Cadillac Club in the past, last being about a year ago. Had a 41 Cadillac convertible Victoria, and also had a 37 Cadillac V16 Imperial Cabriolet. And I'm not a professional oil expert. I'll indicate how I got into that a little later here. So we'll get started with the actual presentation. The first successful oil well was drilled by Colonel Edwin Drake in Titusville, Pennsylvania, 1859. The real use of the oil then was to make kerosene for lighting. Kerosene and gas were used for lighting at that point. They had been using, for the most part, animal fat for mechanical objects to lubricate them before that. Prior to the 1930s, there was only base petroleum oil. Today, there's base petroleum oil. There's petroleum oil that has come from re-refined motor oil, which is still good oil once it's re-refined. There's also synthetic. Synthetic comes from a batch of chemicals, or it comes from a crude base. It can be made in both ways. Prior to the 30s, there weren't any additives in oil. It was just straight mineral oil. So it didn't have all the 20% or so the makeup today as additives. Didn't have any of that. So oil changes had to be very frequent. I have one car that indicates that its 12 quarts of oil should be changed every 700 miles. So things have changed a lot. The first synthetic oil was in 1929, but there was no real use of synthetic much until the 1970s. Motor oil has a number of functions in an engine. Separates metal parts. It cools hot metal surfaces, particularly in the lower part of the engine. That's where most of the cooling occurs, in the engine in the lower part. Crankshaft, mains, rods, rod bearings, to some extent the pistons. So it's important to have, in the summertime certainly, a full component of oil in the sump. So that portion of oil will be a little bit cooler rather than being shrunken down by less volume. Oil also decreases friction, which is the best known attribute. It controls corrosion, and it keeps the engine clean. Old cars and motor oil all cars in general went along pretty well until about the mid-90s. They had some problem with oxidation of oil and thickening in the 60s, but in the mid-90s, engine builders and old engine owners began to note some camshaft failures. And at that time, API SJ oil came out in 1997, and that had about 1,100 parts per million of zinc. Most of it is ZDDP. API is the American Petroleum Institute, and that's the largest trade organization of oil and natural gas industrial people. And they are the ones that designate the API, SN, SM, etc. So 1997, 1,100 parts per million zinc. Preceding oil was 1994, and that was SH, had 1,300 parts per million zinc, 200 more. And zinc had been up to 1,600 in the 1980s. Camshaft failures became epidemic when API SM oil came out in 2004. and that had less than 900 parts per million of zinc. This is when the old engine hobbyists became alarmed, and with some understanding began to focus on the lack of ZDDP in the oil. ZDDP is zinc dialkyl dithiophosphate and is a preponderance in zinc in classic car motor oil and most other motor oils. Now the zinc in synthetic oil is primarily ZDPT, which is zinc dithiophosphate. In 2006, I was the project chairman for the Indiana region of the Classic Car Club, and that's when I began to learn something about oil and get interested in oil, motor oil. Mike Marinas, who's from Cincinnati and is part of our Indiana region, suggested that I might want to talk with DA Lubricant about making a specialty oil for old cars. DA is a company that was in Indianapolis, now it's moved to Lebanon, has a much larger facility. Been in business since 1919, was much associated with a 500-mile race, and their forte is really solving oil problems, designing special oils and so on. It's a very well-respected company. So another fellow by the name of Mark Webb in our region and I went out to DA and talked with Mike Pottinger, the owner of DA, and a number of other officials there, technical and engineers and chemists and so on. And they agreed to come up with an appropriate oil for vintage engines. So in 2007, classic car motor oil then came to fruition. It gained the imprimatur of the Classic Car Club National organization and is sold exclusively by the Indiana region of the Classic Car Club of America. It's one of the first, if not the first, vintage oils on the market. Now, ZDDP was invented by Lubrisol, which is a major additive company, in the early 1940s. But the reason it was invented was to stabilize bearing corrosion, and this is when there was a switch from the old Babbitt bearings to multi-layer bearings, and there began to be some corrosion. So it took care of the corrosion, but also it was found then it was put in oil. It had some other very positive attributes. It's found as a very good anti-wear agent and antioxidant. ZDDP chemically reacts with the metal and forms a sacrificial phosphate layer, which wears rather than the metal. This is particularly important when heavy oil films break down, or where reversible oil thinning occurs, where the viscosity modifying polymers used in multigrade oils tend to stretch out. That's called reversible oil thinning. It was found that as ZDDP was used more and more, that its most important attribute was allaying wear on highly loaded rubbing surfaces. So not only is it an antioxidant and anti-corrosive material, it also, that's the real attribute, is the laying wear on highly loaded rubbing surfaces. The most vulnerable area in the engine, where ZDDP is helpful, is in the camshaft lobe lifter interface. And that's common in many, many vintage engines. Other areas where ZDDP is helpful, particularly, is in the piston ring, cylinder wall interface, rod and main bearings, and piston pins. No one can say for sure how much ZDDP is enough, but with use and time, these vulnerable areas seem to be protected by at a minimum of 1,200 parts per million ZDDP. But one must remember that although we want enough ZDDP, too much can be damaging. It's sacrificial, so it gets used up over time. So you want to have enough in there. When phosphorus reaches 2,000 parts per million, and that's about 2,200 parts per million zinc, that can actually be damaged to the to metal, particularly iron. Classic car motor oil has an average of 1,500 parts per million zinc. The current motor oil in the market for modern cars is called SN+, and that has less than 900. There are other wear agents in motor oil, but the ZDDP is the most effective. Classic car motor oil is 80% base oil, new petroleum, 9% performance additives, and 11% viscosity modifiers or viscosity index improvers. So 20% of that package is additives, and that's in general the case with motor oil today. Detergents and dispersants are a strong part of the performance package. Detergents date back to the early 1930s, and today are usually magnesium or calcium based. They lift deposits from metal surfaces and keep them in suspension. Engine oil is contaminated by soot from incomplete combustion, acids develop into motor oil from combustion byproducts, and oil breakdown, which forms a catalytic acid. Contamination also occurs from oil oxidation, moisture from combustion. There's a half gallon of water as a byproduct of every gallon of gasoline that's burned. Also moisture from condensation, which is a significant situation where these cars sit around a lot. And unfortunately, some people tend to start up a car when someone comes over and run it for a few minutes, turn it off. That's always bad. Hard on the oil and the engine. Also, dirt comes in from the air intake and from the breather. It's other sources of contamination. Most of the oil contamination occurs by blow-by past the piston rings. Detergents and dispersants clean and neutralize oil impurities. They diminish sludge, varnish, acids, and resins. Without a good detergent dispersant package with antioxidants, one can expect increased engine wear, especially in the valve train area, increased deposits, especially on the piston tops and rings, thickening of the oil from oxidation, rapid depletion of the oil additive system, and decreased engine life. If the detergent dispersant package becomes overloaded, deposits and engine damage are imminent. Classic car motor oil has a stronger detergent dispersant package than most automotive oils. This is especially important in a vintage engine, since those engines have a propensity to run short cycles and not burn off water and gasoline that occurs by blow-by in the oil. There's also more blow-by of combustion byproducts, water, and gasoline into the crankcase of these engines of all variety of mechanical conditions, but nothing like the fine tolerances, high technology, and state-of-the-art metallurgy of modern engines. Other additives include cold flow improvers to allow the oil to flow smoothly at low temperatures, anti-foam agents, bases, alkalines, and a few other components. 11% of classic car motor oil is the most important viscosity index improvers or viscosity modifiers. And these are the long chain polymers that are contracted when the oil is cold and then stretch out, expand when the oil is hot to maintain the viscosity or thickness. Classic car motor oil uses the best quality viscosity modifiers, and they're an important and expensive part of the additive package. I remember talking one day to a Lubrisol salesman, old Lubrisol salesman, been there a long time, and he emphasized to me two things. One, how good classic car motor oil was, and two, how one of the old engineers at DA specified and required the highest quality viscosity modifiers. So they are an important very important for multigrade oils. Cheaper, poorer quality viscosity modifiers lead to lower oil pressure and deteriorating oil pressure over time. The viscosity index of classic car motor oil is 135 to 140 as compared to 100 for standard petroleum oil and about 150 for synthetic. The higher the viscosity index, the better the viscosity is maintained with temperature. The shear stability index of classic car motor oil is 24 versus the mid-30s for SN plus oil. And what that means at 24 means that in the test to break up the polymer, actually tear it apart by heavy gears and so on, 24% shears in classic car motor oil versus about the mid-30s in SN plus oil. And oil filters are quite an important part, but not essential to engine health. An oil cooler is helpful as well, but it's a rare vintage engine that has that. The 32 through 39 Packard 12s have that. Most good oil filters will filter out in the 6 to 10 micron range. A micron is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. A meter is 39.37 inches, so pretty small. Give you an idea, bacteria are about 3 microns. Human hair is about 50 microns. And a human can see with his bare eye, a good set of eyes, as low as about 40 microns. The oil filters that aren't as good may filter up to 45 microns, so almost something you can see. When one cuts open an oil filter, I also fly an airplane, so I cut open the oil filter every time I change the oil, every 50 hours in the airplane. And when you look at those pleats, stretch them out and look at the pleats, there are little brown and black specks throughout, a little assorted debris, carbon, whatever they are. Occasionally you see some little piece of metal. Oil filters first came into use about 1930, and most of those were bypass filters, filtering out about 10% for each pass through the system. By 1950, most cars had oil filters, and most of them were full flow. The finer the filter medium, the shorter the filter life, because it gets filled up, and then oil starts going to bypass because it's too high a pressure in the filter. Detergent oil should be used in spite of no oil filter. Detergent oil should not be used in an engine previously using non-detergent oil, because that detergent will clean up that engine, loosen that sludge, end up getting oil passages that are plugged. You have hydraulic lifters, some of those won't be working. Areas that were not leaking oil will start leaking oil. Everything's cleaned up. So if you have an engine that's got detergent oil, not in detergent oil, you got to keep using it until you rebuild the engine. The current modern car motor oil is SN plus, as I indicated, with the plus added in November of 2017. The SN came out with an organization called ILSAC 5, or the 5th meeting of ILSAC. ILSAC is the International Lubrication Standardization and Approval Committee, and they're the ones that formulate what the oil should be the next go-around. ILSAC 6 will come around, expected to be in 2020. Sometimes they're delayed, but that's the expectation. And the ILSAC is made up of oil companies, oil additive companies, and original equipment manufacturers. ILSAC 6 goals are fuel economy to meet CAFE standards, and that's a major thrust with SN plus oil and the new oil coming out, and with the original equipment manufacturers. Wear protection, aeration control, oxidation resistance, emissions control, turbocharger deposit control, durability, and low-speed pre-ignition protection. Now, this is foreign to us in all these old cars, but that's with engines with direct-to-combustion chamber injection. In many of these highly technical engines, motor oil also acts as a hydraulic fluid for cam phasing, variable valve timing, and cylinder deactivation. These features are for fuel efficiency and lowered emissions. The real thrust of the old the car manufacturers and the oil companies and the additive companies is for better emission control and better fuel economy. And I think there's a little bit of a detriment or expense there in longevity of the engine. I remember the chemical engineer at DA telling me once that he thought he had talked to some engineers from Toyota or somewhere, and he got the impression they were expecting a little less longevity of the engines because of all this stress for emission control and high fuel economy. Now, DA recommends oil changes at every 6 months for a car that's stored outside, or 1 year or 3,000 miles for cars that are stored inside. Now, multigrade oil should be used instead of monograde. Now, most of your books are going to say 30 weight, 20 weight, whatever they are, but multigrades came out in the 1950s. That's the way to go today. The big advantage with there's several advantages to multigrade, really. One is a great deal of wear occurs when the engine is first started, and the colder it is, the worse it is, because the oil tends to be thicker. And it takes a while for that oil to get those moving parts. So a monograde is thinner at that cold temperature and gets to those parts more quickly. The top viscosity of multigrade oil or monograde oil, let's say it's SA40, as in classic car motor oil, is 15W40. That viscosity is measured at 100 degrees centigrade, or 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Now there's a lot higher temperatures in the engine than that, certainly, but that's where it's measured. Now, if you look at the curve for viscosity over temperature, as the temperature goes up, once you get to 100 degrees C, the straight weight and the multigrade will both be at 40 weight in this case. But beyond that 100 degrees C, the curve starts to drop off more with monograde. So the multigrade really retains its viscosity better with increased temperature. The multigrade then provides better protection in high temperature areas like the ring cylinder wall interface. ZDDP is helpful there as well, certainly. Since the multigrade is a little thicker, it gets thrown less into the combustion chamber to be burned and create deposits. It also forms a better ring cylinder wall seal for better compression and less blow-by. And multigrade stays on the metal parts just as well as the thicker monograde over time as the engine sets idle. Classic car motor oil is the optimal oil for the vintage engine. Maintains its viscosity very well with engine temperatures, and in most all cases, better over time than petroleum-based oils, and comparable with modern car motor oil. The ZDDP optimal level protects areas where there is a dearth of oil. The camshaft left interface is protected much better than with modern car oil. A higher level of detergents and dispersants is best in the vintage engine with more blow-by, frequent short cycles. The anti-corrosion, anti-rust package is better than that in the modern car motor oil, and needs to be, because how the modern engines are constructed and used as compared to the vintage. There is no need or indication for synthetic oil in classic car motor oil. Synthetic oil is a little finer grain and a little slicker than petroleum-based, and optimal for the close, smooth tolerances in modern engines. It will also withstand extremes of low and high temperature better than petroleum oil. Not needed in most vintage engines, but helpful in turbocharged and racing engines. Synthetic oil is necessary to have those very low viscosities that the new cars call for. Some of them down to zero now, 0W. Synthetic oil also absorbs water more than petroleum oil, so it's not an ideal quality for a vintage engine. which run a lot of short cycles. The expensive full synthetic is more than standard motor oil. When all factors considered, there's no valid reason to use synthetic oil in classic car motor oil or the vintage engine. The modern engine oil golds of fuel economy to meet CAFE standards, emission control, turbocharger deposit control, low-speed pre-ignition control are not in synchronization with vintage engines and classic car motor oil. Those golds are minimal wear and corrosion in concert with a clean engine. Classic car motor oil is not recommended for cars with a catalytic converter. Those usually came out about 1975. And the reason there is that the phosphorus in the classic car motor oil tends to coat the active surface of the catalytic converter and render it less effective. It should not also be used in air-cooled engines. The problem with air-cooled engines is that the detergent burns and makes an ash, and so motor oils used in air-cooled engines have dispersants only, not detergents. So there are several reasons then to use classic car motor oil, special motor oil for old cars. Chiefly among the higher detergent dispersant package for these engines that tend to have more blow-by, more dirt. Also, the ZDDP is very important, as I've indicated before, in allaying wear anywhere there's a dearth of oil or anywhere that there's really a high loads, like the cam lifter interface most commonly. It maintains its viscosity very well with a multigrade. So we think it's the optimal oil, better than any other really for vintage engines. Warner, do you have some questions? Warner does the telephone answering for people who call up about classic car motor oil. It can also be ordered from a website. And so he gets questions at times, and these are some of the questions that he has fielded. Want to go ahead, Warner?
Okay, so we thought it'd be helpful just to let you hear what I hear when people call in that most of them are not oil experts. So I've got 8 questions that I get a lot. John's going to answer those. And then when we're done, you may have more questions. John can answer more questions. So why is classic car motor oil 15W40 instead of 10W40 or something else?
Well, I think it was thought that 15W was fine for vintage engines. Most of the cases they're not really run in really cold weather anyway. And Warner specifically mentioned 10W. Well, for the 15W is designed to flow correctly at plus 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The 10W is designed to flow correctly at 4 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's been not much different. So it depends on the need, and the feeling was 15W was fine for what we're doing. Go ahead, Warner.
Is classic car motor oil just for old cars?
It's for any old engine, really, as long as it's not, as I said, hadn't been using non-detergent oil, or it's not an air-cooled engine. If it's an engine that's in a car that has a catalytic converter, then the oil could still be used, but it's going to diminish the effectiveness of the converter.
So you're including tractors and
tractors, sure.
Motorboats.
Motorboats are water cooled. So sure.
Why choose classic car motor oil?
Now I might say, Warner, I have a motorboat down at the lake. I use classic car motor oil in that.
Inboard?
Routinely. It's an outboard, but it's water cool. Water circulates through it. And my car down there too, I keep it in that.
Why choose classic car motor oil over other motor oil claiming to be for the vintage engine?
Well, we know what's in classic car motor oil. We don't know what's in the others. We think ours is the best. If you look at an oil like Hemmings, it says it's a blended Synthetic means there's some synthetic. How much? 10%, 5%, 50%? They don't say. They do say there's about 1,600 parts per million ZDDP. They don't tell you anything about the detergent dispersant package. They tell you nothing about the rust inhibitors, it's anything. So there's very little data. And that's the case with any oil. If you look it up, you can't find anything much on any of the oils. Try to find it on the internet. I suppose if you were an oil professional and had some access to somebody in the company, you might find something. But by and large, we don't know.
Is there a shelf life for classic car motor oil?
DEA puts a shelf life of 3 years on it.
How is the cost of classic car motor oil related to the other oils?
Classic car motor oil works out with the shipping to $7.50 a case. Now, if you pick it up in Indianapolis, which we keep a stock there, and you save the shipping, which is $20, so it's even less. Hemmings motor oil is $8.99 or full synthetic $11.99, and there's a couple of oils that are for high mileage. And again, what they have in them, who knows? They don't really specify. Engines, Pennzoil has one, $8.49 a quart. Valvoline, $8.49 a quart. So it's very competitively priced.
Can you buy less than a case of classic car motor oil?
No, not unless you find somebody who wants to split one with you. But our case is 12. Hemmings is 6.
Is classic car motor oil sold in retail stores or parts stores?
No, it's only sold through the Indiana Region Classic Car Club.
Why is there 1,500 ppm of ZDDP classic car motor oil?
The chemists there and the engineers at DA felt that was adequate. I say you don't want to get too much. Certainly you don't want to get in a situation where you're pouring ZDDP in or other things in your motor oil. You never know what kind of mix you're going to end up with. You can balance or you can mess up the fine balance that was designed by the chemists and engineers when the oil was, any oil was first formulated. So that's not a good thing to do. And as I say, if you get too much ZDDP, you can actually damage the engine.
Is classic car motor oil a good break-in oil?
Yes, in fact, we have one customer who buys a number of cases every year, and he builds engines. He uses it, and he's the one who was alarmed. Told us first of all about being alarmed in the mid '90s when the oil came out with 1,100 parts per million. I think it only went down from there. ZDDP.
Okay,
that's it.
Of my question.
Okay, any.
I have a flat tappet air-cooled engine, a Corvair. What kind of oil should I use?
Well, you shouldn't use anything with regular detergents in it. What do they recommend for that car?
I'm using Shell Vitality.
Well, see, air-cooled engines tend to build up a lot more heat than water-cooled. And the problem with the Shell Vitality is going to have a lot of detergent in it. That detergent gets burned to ash and can create more sludge, resins, acids, etc. What does your book say? What does it recommend? The old book.
Well, back in '65, it was just 10W30
Huh.
oil, but that had a lot of zinc.
Well, maybe those carburetor engines don't get really hot. I really don't know. Is there anybody in the technical department of Corvair Club or whatever that would know something like that?
Every time we discuss this, there's 5 different opinions about who has the best oil, so I don't know. It kind of depends on who's selling it. You gotta know the truth.
Yeah, that's true.
You'd have the zinc level and the Rotella.
Yeah, the Rotella T is made for diesel engines, and that's why I use it, because it still retains the zinc.
Yeah, but that's been cut down a lot, and it's hard to find out even how much that has in it.
But they have so many T's now. T3,
Yeah.
T4,
That's what I mean. It's hard. You don't know.
I had to go for the low T's. 230. The higher the T, the more they cost. I don't know.
I think the higher the T, the more synthetic.
Yeah, I think so. That's why I don't go.
I don't know.
Say yes, and it hasn't been too heavy.
I don't know what the answer is there.
Probably scheduled.
I would not recommend using classic motor oil in the Corvair just because of the detergent. I know the aircraft engines, as I said, there are no detergents because it burns to ash, all dispersants. Maybe the carburetor engine doesn't get nearly as hot, I don't know, but it's air cooled, so it's going to get hot.
About cylinder head temperature runs about 300 degrees.
Yeah.
That's cylinder head.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is perfect for that car. That's what they're supposed to run at. Interestingly enough, a carburetor runs cooler when it's idling than it does when it's running. So it's great for cars you can't overheat them.
See, that's about what my airplane runs, about 300 degrees. So
It'll run 250 in a parade.
you could use aircraft oil. You'd be in good shape with that.
Yeah.
I use in the airplane Phillips XC 2050. That's not going to be a problem with the air-cooled engine. That's probably the safest approach.
Am I correct in assuming that you would not recommend additives like
Exactly.
products or rest?
You don't know what you're getting. And again, you might mess up the fine balance of oil chemistry that's formulated by the chemists and engineers. And as I said, you get too much ZDDP in there. Who knows how much you're going to get? Get too much, you can start damaging the engine. So no, don't do that.
Second question. I have a friend that's a diesel mechanic and maintains diesel boats. He also collects old cars, and he says he uses diesel lubricating oil designed for diesel engines in his old car. I don't know what the difference is in those oils as opposed to standard or yours. Do you know why he would recommend that?
Well, of course, I don't have any idea how much ZDDP is in it. That's one of the things you'd like to get in oil. It probably doesn't have. It would have quite a bit of detergent because it's probably a light diesel oil, but it wouldn't have the wonderful anti-rust package we have in classic car motor oil. That rust package meets some military specification, and it was designed to keep engines from rusting while they're shipped over into the tropics, and set around for months. So it's a really good. That's if you bought the oil for no other reason, buy it for that, But some people do use the diesel, but you're better off using something that's really designed to use in the old cars, and that's this oil.
So if my vehicle is a 39 Cadillac, I think currently has been using like modern, say 1530 or so oil, is it wise then for me to switch? Or not?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, there's no problem with that. In fact, you should switch.
Yeah, I was worried about when you said about deposits of the
No, you got detergents and all in that oil, so no, you're not going to have. If you were to tear your engine down, you'd find it was clean. Yeah. No, that you ought to switch.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Anybody else?
You gonna have any of those shirts for sale?
We could make them available. Somebody in the club made this up for me. Thought it needed to look appropriate to do the presentation.
You have oil here?
Talk to our president there. He's the president of our region right there, Don. You might start taking orders, Don.
There you go. You have oil here?
We have oil. That's Warner's domain there. We've got, I brought down 12 cases.
And what was the price on that again?
$69.50. You don't have to pay freight if you buy it from here. So you save the $20, so $69.50. But that's 12 quarts, so you get quite a bit of oil.
Any sales tax on that here, Warner?
Not in Louisville.
Okay.
If we sold it in New Albany, it'd be 7%.
Ah, okay.
Not in this hotel.
Good. We're on the right side of the river.
What's the viscosity? What is it?
1540.
1540.
Yeah, we only have the one product. Sell it one way, 12 quarts in a case. So they don't even inventory it as spare quarts. They have cases in stock.
I might say that I was talking to DA about this, one of the chemists over there. He said in general, you can go one grade higher, one grade lower, like 40 to 50 or 40 to 30 or, with no problem. Also, your old cars that may have been using a high of 30 weight in the summer, in a cold morning, that oil is pretty heavy, pretty thick, and that oil pump's working pretty hard to pump that oil around until it finally warms up. Well, with 15 W40, you're starting out with an oil that's going to flow very well on any cold summer morning, or even the winter down, that goes down to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, plus 5. So, it's not, I don't see it as a problem.
Why 40 over 30?
Just because the cars usually are a little looser, they can take that, looser tolerances, they can take that a little higher grade. And as I said, 1 grade difference doesn't make any difference anyway. The 30, if you use 30, you can use 40. Not a problem.
A car like the manufacturer said, the Cadillac, my era said 1030.
Well, now, what year Cadillac you talking? Oh, okay.
So, why would I want to go to 40? The engine's not worn.
Well, if you prefer not to do that, then you get some other oil. But we make only the 1540. We do not make a 30. No. We're trying to make one oil that's going to work for the majority of old engines.
I have a question.
Sure.
I came late, but don't know if they answered it or not. I have a 64 Cadillac down the film, but I live in the Caribbean. So there's no winters. Summertime all year long. 75, 80 degrees. What kind of grade do I need for that car?
I'd use a multigrade. I don't see any reason to use a monograde, really.
Okay.
As I say, the multigrade, an awful lot of your engine is higher than 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And at that point, beyond that point, the monograde is going to fall off in viscosity more than the multigrade. So, as I said, the multigrade is going to get thrown less into the combustion chamber to get burned up. It's going to make a little better seal at the ring cylinder wall. It's going to give you better protection, really, than a monograde. Now, some mechanics might disagree with that, but what I've found is mechanics really don't seem to know much about motor oil. There's a fellow does a lot of speaking in the aircraft world, very knowledgeable on mechanics, but not very good on what he knows about oil. So, multigrade is really very little use, I think, for monograde oil. Now, some people will intrinsically believe that, I want to use a monograde because it'll stay on the metal parts and my engine's sitting around. Well, there were some tests done by Phillips, and they found that the multigrade and the monograde, over a period of time, stayed on the metal parts equally well. They weighed them very carefully over a period of time, and so I really can't think of a good reason to use monograde, even in the Caribbean. Yeah.
Is it essential to use non-ethanol fuel in these old cars, or is it okay?
Be nice if you can get it, because the ethanol is, it doesn't produce the power as well. It creates all kinds of problems in the gas tank and the oil lines and the carburetor and fuel pump. But I know there's a website, which I have written down at home, that tells where you can get
Pure gas.
Is that it?
Pure
Okay.
gas.
And I know in Indianapolis we got 1 or 2 places, but they're way out. And if I'm taking a trip somewhere, I'm going to be using 10% ethanol gas anyway. So I have not made any point to go get it. But I know down at the lake when I get gas before, because we only use the boat like 1 week a year, I fill it up with non-ethanol fuel. It is better, but it's strictly a political thing, to have the ethanol in there. It's not solid science or engineering. Yeah.
Tell me if this is right or wrong. The criteria I've used for motor oil selection is if your engine is a flat tappet engine, then you use the high zinc oils. If it's a roller cap engine, then you could go with regular oils. Is that true?
Well, but why do you want to deny yourself the extra protection of the ZDDP? As I say,
Well, if the other oil is adequate, it's a fraction of the cost. Basically, that's it.
a fraction of the cost.
Yeah.
You buy cheap oil, you're going to get a cheap product. You're going
I'm
to,
not talking about cheap oil. I'm talking about buying name brand 10W30 oil.
yeah.
You know,
It's going to cost you, if you buy name brand and quality oil, it's going to cost you the same as classic car motor oil. You're not going to get any cheaper, or not much cheaper. So why not get the thing that's going to work best for you? Of course, in your case, you should be using probably aircraft oil anyway.
okay. That's what I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, but all the 1930s Cadillac flatheads are all roller tappet. So,
Well, my Packard had roller cams
yeah,
in it.
yeah.
I don't know. I used regular oil in it because it had roller cams in it.
But you get extra protection, I said, in anywhere where the oil, film is very, very thin, like in the mains, the rods, the ring cylinder wall area. It's that added protection. Let the phosphate wear out and not your metal.
Interesting talk. My wife wants to go play the pony, so.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else?
John.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. Yeah.